Growing up in the suburbs of Texas, my parents were the only Taiwanese immigrants in our predominantly white middle-class neighborhoods. I wasn't really exposed to Asian American communities outside of my parents' alumni network and the Chinese school I attended summers and on Sundays during the school year. As the only family to relocate to the U.S., we would make our voyage back to Taiwan every other summer to visit our family. And while these communities provided me with a sense of belonging and family, they were never quite spaces for feminist discourse. I sought that education elsewhere. As I came into my feminism, I subconsciously viewed it as separate from my racial identity, but that was only because my schools didn't teach me about our rich history of political activism. It didn't expose me to our feminist leaders and writers or our stories. Today, I know that my Asian Americanness and my feminism are deeply intertwined and that struggles for racial justice and gender justice have infinite intersections. My name is Tiffany Tso, and I'm a co-founder of the Asian American Feminist Collective. I had the honor of serving on the Community Advisory Committee for Hear Us Rise, APA Voices in Feminism, as well as writing the text for the exhibit. I'm proud to be able to help narrate this virtual tour for Wing Luke Museum, along with Seattle's own Maria Batayola, so that young APA feminists everywhere can get the history lessons that I wish I had growing up.
When I was 14 years old, my mom brought me to the United States. Our whole family had to immigrate with my dad. We came for Boeing. My dad was trained as an aeronautical engineer, and Mom really felt strongly that the whole family should come so that the family doesn't break apart with usually what happens. And I realized that my mom was really a hardcore feminist because she would say to us, number one, we're a matriarchal society. And she would say, in terms of leading the family, the male is the head of the family, but the woman is the neck. So she gets to drive the direction. And I think from that, it became really clear that family was very important, that society was very important, the extended family. We don't have welfare in the Philippines. So a lot of that assistance comes from there. You know, I went to University of Washington, so that was during the Vietnam era time, from 71 to 75, and that was when it was really beginning to open up. It was the 1964 Civil Rights Act just passed, and there was equal opportunity and equal access to programs, services, and facilities, regardless of race, gender, national origin, religion, and so forth. And so it was a norm for us as young women. And I know that was within the small group that I was. It was also the anti-Marxist movement that pushed the feminism. Again, very strong women in our area. Domestic violence was beginning to be articulated at that time. With 40 other folks, I wound up co-founding the Asian Pacific Islander Women and Family Safety Center, which is now called API Chaya. Chaya is a South Asian statewide organization that had merged with API Safety Center, which was Puget Sound focused. We had a sister organization called Korean Women's Association down in Tacoma, Pierce County, that did that kind of service. And so within that process, I was founding co-chair, and we had to really think through what is it that we're doing, because the popular feminist approach was to remove the woman from the home, let her leave, you know, get extra keys, money, set aside clothing, and so forth. And for us, that would destroy the fundamental fabric of what we felt was community. So how do you keep the family? How do you have healing for the perpetrator? How do you have survival for the victim and the children? Most of the victims were women, although in our matriarchal society, we also had some big, hyper-strong women. And so we came up with this model wherein API, Women and Safety Center, provided services and advocacy for the survivors, the women and the children. ACRS provided counseling for the the perpetrator. And Rewa also had this kind of expansive, because that was the beginnings of South Asian people coming, and not as numerically as many as the others. So it was really clear that the goals were the same: strong women, present in all institutions, present in leadership, but not necessarily at the expense of the family.
One question that we often hear as the Asian American Feminist Collective is, what is APA feminism? Which is why it was crucial for us to define it for this exhibit, and it's really important for us to continue to define it as things shift socially, culturally, and politically. Asian Pacific American feminism was birthed from the radical histories and lived experiences of our communities. It provides a lens to confront the intersecting systems of power that our communities face, including white supremacy, patriarchy, and Western imperialism. Though constantly evolving, APA feminism isn't new, nor is it an isolated practice. Responding to a lack of acceptance and discomfort within mainstream feminist movements, as well as sexism within APA spaces, women and other people of marginalized genders in our communities have drawn on learnings from Black feminist thought and Third World feminist movements. In Hear Us Rise, you will encounter the voices, stories, portraits, and movements in the APA feminist fight for liberation. The entirety of APA feminism is expansive and impossible to contain within these walls, or even in digital space. So we invite you to view this exhibit as an introduction, a portal to kick off your own individual exploration into these histories, topics, and themes.
So in the early 70s, President Carter started planning for this National Women's Conference that was in 1977. And he had the states organize women's conferences. So in Washington State, it was going to be in Ellensburg. The Asian Pacific women, back then, we didn't have a name yet, wanted to gather, realizing that there was a distinct voice and distinct needs that we had to be able to articulate at the larger conference. The team called themselves the Asian Pacific Women's Caucus. A lot of the principles we developed back then, like for services, multilingual, cross-cultural, disaggregation of data, having our own voice, ourselves at the table, those same principles continue to this day. It always goes back to what is the goal, right? The goal isn't just to put women in power. The goal is, what are you going to change when you get in power? What are you going to accomplish to make sure that, again, respect, equal access to opportunities, equal access to programs and services and facilities come about? And that's where we've had our women, our sisters running. So Dolores Sibonga was the first one. She's first Filipina on Seattle City Council. And then Martha Tso ran also, first Korean American immigrant, a daughter of an immigrant. We've had Cheryl Chow, who is the daughter of Ruby Chow. Ruby was the first Chinese woman on the King County Council, and Cheryl was over at City of Seattle Council. And then Velma Valoria, first Filipino state representative, Sharon Tomika Santos, first Japanese American representative, and of course you have other API males along that. So there is a rhythm to the work wherein as issues come up, we push back.
A portion of the exhibit walks us through a timeline highlighting the various ways APA women and gender nonconforming people have resisted the intersecting oppressions of racism, sexism, and colonialism throughout history and today. From the colonization of our nations by the U.S. government and the legal exclusion of our immigration into the country to the many different movements sparked from within our communities to decolonize, end violence, fight for equality, and liberate our people, we can draw lines between our history and contemporary activism, learn how progress has been made, how change is hard-won and sometimes not at all. But most of all, we see so much strength, survival, resilience, transnational and intergenerational solidarity.
I did a film, we filmed the remaining founding moms, and we asked them, what is precious and important about this? And it was very touching. It was friendship, because at times of stress and duress, you need to know who's going to have your back. It was having same kind of goals, and it was growing together. So we're hoping that, many of us can give that for the younger generation. And they've had their own organizations, so that this is a continuous story, and that, more power to everybody.
Because of the caucus, I felt more empowered. I felt like going out there and speaking up and making trouble much more. So my 3 words are 2 words: making trouble.
Hear Us Rise opened to the public on March 6, 2020, at the start of the COVID-19 outbreak in the U.S., which meant that the museum had to close its doors as Washington state went into lockdown to prevent the virus from spreading. The exhibit has unfortunately only been available for public view for 6 weeks total of its year-long run. Throughout this pandemic, our communities have been battling new waves of anti-Asian racism and hate incidents. Economically, our Chinatowns and Asian-owned small businesses have been suffering. Our communities are struggling, but we're surviving through networks of care in the form of mutual aid organizations that sprung up in the absence of state assistance. We're at the beginning of a new presidency, with Kamala Harris as our first Black and Asian American and woman vice president. Across the ocean, protesting farmers are being suppressed in India. The people of Myanmar are rising up against a military coup. There are uprisings and movements led by APA feminists happening all across the globe. Here we are, and you will
hear us rise.
Hear us rise.